Let's talk more about official government UFO reports. We have one from a president of the United States, and that's about as official as you can get. You may have heard that President Jimmy Carter once saw a UFO back in the 1960s before he was the president. It's a story he's told in public any number of times, but it wasn't until the wide reach of podcasts that we were actually able to solve it. The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast is one that played a role. To tell the story of what happened, we're going to begin by traveling down to Plains, Georgia, to the private residence of President Jimmy Carter.
Hi, I'm Josh Carter. Welcome to Plains. I'm President Carter's grandson, and we're sitting in his office right now.
So how did we come to have President Carter on the Skeptic's Guide podcast?
So Jay would have a question at the end of every episode that would, for audience engagement. He would ask a question about any given topic. And one of the questions that he asked was,
name the former world leader that used to laugh at UFO believers, but later became a believer himself when he himself witnessed one. Think about that and be the first one to answer correctly. Good luck, everyone.
And I was like, man, I know exactly who he's talking about. So I emailed the Skeptic's Guide.
We got an email from a guy, who claimed to be President Jimmy Carter's grandson. And, I have to say that I was a little bit skeptical.
So Steve emailed me back and he was like, okay, we believe your story and we believe what you said, but do you have any proof? What proof can you give us that you're Jimmy Carter's grandson? And so I sent him my wedding photo with me, my wife, and my grandparents standing next to me, pretty definitive proof that I am saying who I am who I say I am.
So I invited Josh to come on the show and tell us the story of President Carter's UFO sighting.
And I said, well, I could, but would you like to talk to my grandfather instead? And he was like, yes. Sorry, I'd rather talk to your grandfather than you, no offense. So I called my grandfather and I asked if he would be on the Skeptic's Guide. And he said, sure.
So in 2007, episode 105 of our podcast, we had on President Jimmy Carter, and he told us his story.
Well, back in those days, I was the district governor of 56 Lions clubs. And I had to visit each one of those clubs during my year of service. And I was in a small South Georgia town one night outside the schoolhouse waiting to eat supper and to talk to them. And all of us, there were 26 men, I believe, if I remember right. All of us saw a very bright light in the western sky. And it was bright enough to attract our attention, much brighter than a star. And it got closer and closer, and then it seemed to stop in its proximity to us. And then the color of it changed from white to blue to red. And it stayed there for a while. All of us were aghast at what we were seeing, couldn't figure it out. And then the light, that's all we could see, not a solid object, the light then slowly disappeared back into the direction from which it came. So I'm a scientist by training, and I have never thought there were extraterrestrial beings on a ship from outer space or anything, but it was an unidentified flying object. It was obviously unidentified. It was flying, and it was an object. Mm-hmm. And so that's the limit of my experience with so-called UFOs.
So he told that story, and for several years anyway, that was the end of it.
Meanwhile, there's this professor from Georgia Tech, Jerry Justice.
Well, as a native Georgian, I've always been interested in Georgia history and was one day reading the book by Don Rhodes, Georgia Myths and Legends, and it gives an account of Carter seeing the UFO and includes a replica of his actual UFO report. And when I read the details of that description, I said, that sounds exactly like someone describing seeing a barium release cloud. When I started graduate school, I needed some support, so I got a job as a research assistant on an Air Force project. And one of the things involved was rocket launches from Eglin Air Force Base.
So what were these rockets doing?
Well, the rockets that released the barium would take up a canister, if you will, of barium chemical and release it out at a point in the atmosphere. And this would be in sunlight at altitude, but dark on the surface, so you could get good pictures of this glowing release of barium material.
So the barium itself was in sunlight, and you're viewing it against a black sky.
That's correct.
So one day, out of the blue, I get an email from this guy, Jerry Justice. He is a Georgia Tech professor, and he just sends me an email quickly and say, hey, I think I figured out your grandfather's UFO story.
The sunlight would be strong enough to actually ionize part of the barium, and the neutral barium would look greenish, bluish color. The ionized barium would look a sort of reddish color and would stretch out along the field lines of the Earth's magnetic field. And so this was part of the studies, is to determine characteristics of the Earth's magnetic field at those altitudes.
The Air Force was absolutely launching sounding rockets during that time and continues to this day for a variety of purposes. They would have had different things in them that they would have dumped into the atmosphere, for example, to test radio reflectability and other aspects of military operations. So it's not unusual or odd at all that a person could have seen a cloud like that in the sky.
As it starts out as a small little point of light that glows, and it expands into a big giant orb that turns red or blue, depending on how the sun hits it and how the barium gets ionized, and then it dissipates. And I was like, wow, that sounds exactly like the story that I've heard my entire life of my grandfather's UFO.
So did you pass that on? And what did the president think of that?
He was excited about it. He was excited to have an answer. And moving from unidentified to identified, very satisfactory for him. He wanted to know what it was. Because when my grandfather told that story, a lot of people assumed that he saw Venus. He grew up looking at the sky. He grew up interested in astronomy. He grew up as a naval officer. He knew what Venus looked like, and he was offended that people thought that he didn't know what Venus was.
Professor Justice tracked down the exact launch on the right day and time that President Carter had been outside the Lions Club, and found that Carter's estimates of direction and elevation had been almost exactly right on the money.
Well, my initial findings I sent to the Carter Center and heard back from them that they had passed it along to President Carter for his analysis, and he basically concurred that it was plausible that that was indeed what he had seen.
And so, to the president's own satisfaction, it turns out that his UFO was a fairly exotic piece of airborne clutter, an artificial barium cloud.